Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. During this slow summer season of the art world, we thought it'd be fun to travel back in time and get a better feeling for what it was like to be in the art world in the 1960s. So in this week's episode, we're joined by Michael Findlay, an esteemed art dealer, director of Acquavella Galleries, and author of the brand new book, Portrait of the Art Dealer as a Young Man, New York in the 60s. We chat with Michael about his motivations for writing the book, and we hear memorable stories from his career, including his relationship with Andy Warhol. Michael also shares insights on the art world before it became investment-focused, and he discusses how things have changed. Michael also offers valuable advice for both new and seasoned collectors. We hope you enjoy our conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Michael, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Adam. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. It's our pleasure. Well, as I mentioned, your new book, Portrait of the Art Dealer as a Young Man, New York in the 60s, it comes out in early September. You can get it at your local bookstore, at a museum store, Amazon, wherever you buy books. You can also actually pre-order it right now on Amazon. I had a chance to receive an advanced copy. It was really entertaining, and I learned a lot as well, so I'm excited to chat with you about it. I think a great place to start would be, for our listeners, just tell us a little bit about the new book and really what motivated you to write it.
Well, it's a memoir, and it follows my life basically from birth in 1945 to 1977. It's basically in four parts. The first part, which is perhaps the least interesting to American readers, is me getting educated or semi-educated in Scotland and England. The most important part starts in 1964 when I arrive in New York. I came for 2 weeks without papers and $200 in my pocket, which I soon spent. And I wanted to stay in New York. I didn't know anybody. I loved it. And so I got a job eventually in an art gallery. And so the book follows my trajectory from getting that job in the spring of 1964 until basically 1977, which some of us, and I use us loosely perhaps to discuss my peer group, we felt that the 60s didn't end until 1977. I don't quite know why, but that was a notion we had at the time. So, and I discussed people I met. I didn't have an ambition to be an art dealer. I actually wanted to be a poet. That was, and I knew I wasn't going to make any money as a poet. So a girlfriend suggested I get a job in an art gallery, sitting at the door, smiling at people. And I thought that was a very, very good idea. But I soon found myself in sort of as the number 3 person in a 4-person gallery owned and run by a man named Richard Feigen. And it was a gallery that in the old school classic example showed contemporary artists in the quote-unquote front rooms, and in the back rooms supported that by selling secondary market paintings, anything from Monet to Clifford Still to Gorky to Joseph Cornell. So I actually, although I didn't realize it when I started, I did an apprenticeship, and I was 18 when I began. And what the advantage for me now, as I see it now, I didn't realize it then. I was thrown into a very small world, but a world that was filled with very creative people who engaged with each other, engaged with me as a youngster, amazingly, without patronizing me at all, basically teaching me. And these included artists, these included curators, these included collectors, particularly, so I learned from all of these people.
Yeah, so you arrived in New York in the 60s, and you've worked in the art world ever since. And along the way, you've encountered and worked with many remarkable artists through your career, and you chronicle a lot of those relationships in your book. Can you share one of your favorite memories here that you do include in the book about your experiences with one of the well-known artists that you have worked with?
Well, why don't we start with Andy Warhol?
A great place to start.
Yeah, I think it's important, probably. And I think one of the reasons I wrote the book was to try to create a landscape that where there was a fairly even horizon. I mean, we look back now from our vantage point, and we look at fame and auction prices. And what we don't realize is that in 1964 there was a fair hierarchy of quote unquote importance among artists, but it didn't really have to do with sales. It probably had to do to a degree with visibility. But Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, George Siegel, Marisol, Jim Rosenquist, all pretty much on the same level. Many of them were Castelli artists, and Castelli was very well known as a gallery, but they weren't gigantic. They weren't giants. I mean, they weren't astride the art world as we might imagine they were. So when I encountered Andy, was actually at a very informal dinner downtown in a Greek restaurant. There were no, in those days, there were no paparazzi following the art market, and it wasn't the market, it was just the art world, and it was very handheld. Everybody paid for themselves. There were no collectors. There were artists and friends of artists. So I sat next to this guy. I knew who he was. I recognized him. I hadn't met him before. And I had met Gerard Malanga because I was involved in the poetry world. And Gerard Malanga at that time I knew was also working for Andy. So I introduced myself. I said, well, I know Gerard. And I asked him, probably naively, what he was working on in terms of paintings. And he said, oh, I've stopped painting. I'm not painting anymore. I'm not going to do any more paintings. I'm going to concentrate on movies. And I said, okay, what kind of movies? And he said, Hollywood movies. So that he had this ambition to make quote unquote real Hollywood movies, which of course he couldn't do because he was Andy. I mean, he'd made Empire. He'd made a movie all night long of filming the Empire State Building. That was hardly a Hollywood movie, but he was talking about making movies with people, and a script. Although in fact, everybody went off script. And then we started talking about, I don't know, we realized we both had Catholic upbringings. And so somehow the discussion got into, wouldn't it be good to have a confessional scene in a movie, like a guy confessing to the Pope? And then, so anyway, that was the direction. The conversation took a very interesting direction. And in fact, some years later, because we remained friendly all his life from then on, when I was living in Soho, he asked me if he could use my loft to film in. And it was the loft above the gallery that I was running. It was then called Feigen Downtown. It was on 141 Green Street. So I had tons and tons of space, and I lived above the shop. It was a 3-story loft building. So I said, yeah, of course you can. He said, we'll just be in there one day. Now, I was away that day, but I had just hired a young man whose parents were actually well-known dealers in Philadelphia. And he was probably not more than 17 or 18. And his mother had basically handed him into my care. I wasn't that much older myself, and said, please see that he gets, a start in the art world or some experience. And so I stuck him at the front counter, which was the only counter. Our office consisted of a front counter made out of plywood painted white. And I said, by the way, I don't know whether I used his name or not. I said, this guy's going to come by today, and he's going to go up to my place on the third floor, and he's going to shoot a movie with some people. I said, but it's not going to affect the gallery. The gallery is open. He's just going up the stairs. So I kind of forgot about it. I went, I did my business. I came back at the end of the day, and this young man who was, despite the fact that it was the 60s, he'd had a very conservative, relatively conservative upbringing. We would probably describe him as preppy. He was panting with excitement, and he had lipstick smeared on his face and traces of eyeshadow.
Wow.
And he could barely contain himself. And I said, well, what happened? He said, oh, I got to play a dead transvestite in an Andy Warhol movie. So,
oh, wow.
So I never saw the movie. I don't know whether the movie was ever made, because Andy shot lots and lots of stuff that never got made. So anyway, that was Andy Warhol.
That's a pretty incredible story, I have to say. And something you touched on a little bit in that story, and you do even more so in your book, is about your recollections of the art world before there was an art market, or at least before there was a significant emphasis on art as an investment for contemporary art. And really, the idea of that kind of art world seems almost inconceivable to most collectors under a certain age, 20s, 30s, 40s, whatever it is. Tell us about what that time was like and really how different it was from today's art world.
It's not so easy for me to answer that in a way, because I think I wrote the book so that the people that you've just described can imagine or envisage or see a totally different approach, because it's very difficult to look through today's lens backwards without imposing the way we think things are done now as having always been in place. So often I will speak to collectors today, and their attitude is, oh my God, if only I had been active in those days, boy, I would have bought, Jasper Johns for $1,500.
Right.
And what they don't understand is they wouldn't have, because first of all, there was no such word as an art market. If somebody had mentioned market, we would have said Sixties is over on Lexington Avenue. That we didn't use. There's a whole vocabulary today like gallerist, etc., which is a relatively modern invention, maybe late 20th century, 1990s, invented the art market and part of the lingo that people use today. So the people who were buying contemporary art at the time were outliers as far as collectors went. They were individuals with a certain amount of expendable income and quirky taste. People like Bob and Ethel Scull, John and Kimiko Powers, the publisher, Harry Abrams, and his wife, Nina. He published lots of the first books about pop artists. But they were not the core. At the core, you had people who were in Europe and in America, the the well-known collectors of the day, they were buying Picasso, they were buying Matisse, they were buying Miro, they were buying impressionist pictures. That was the art world. That was what most dealers made their money doing, and there were lots of dealers who dealt with surrealism, cubism, impressionism. Abstract expressionism had risen, and that was also probably, I won't say too expensive for, but it was already historical. So these collectors I've mentioned, they were looking at, I'm using a modern word now, cutting edge, but they were going to galleries that was relatively off the beaten track, and they were buying work by what we now call emerging artists. But they were not, I had never had a conversation with anybody in those days that was relevant to what I was selling today would be worth tomorrow. It would have been almost a ludicrous situation. I mean, even someone like Joe Hirschhorn, who used to buy 3 or 4 things. If he liked an artist, he'd buy 3 or 4 things. He liked to get a great deal. But it wasn't because he was ever going to sell. It was because he thought one day he'd have a museum, which he did, right? So he liked to buy in bulk, but it wasn't for investment. So also, many of those people were collecting against the grain. They knew each other, yes, but they didn't constitute a social crowd. There was no cachet in what they were doing. There was no social cachet. There wasn't going to get them on any museum boards in those days. Buying a wooden box stenciled with Brillo, for $200 from the Stable Gallery was not going to put you in any collecting league in those days. And people like Bob Scull, who were building big collections of pop art, those people who wanted the limelight got featured in articles that basically presented them as idiotic for spending money on trash like this, And when artists did begin to become well known to the general public, you would see an article in Life magazine, Roy Lichtenstein, is he the worst artist in America? So even when things were presented to the general public, it was with a wink, wink, nod, nod. These people are crazy. So nowadays, I don't want to comment on I don't need to comment on what's going on now, but it would seem to me that the exact opposite is perhaps true now, whereby spending much larger sums of money, obviously, but even coming out of the gate, in those days, an artist would come out of the gate at $500 to $1,500, and now I guess they come out of the gate at I don't know, $50,000 to $100,000, depending upon. But in those days they weren't marketed; they just had paintings on the wall of a gallery and a price list. Now there's a whole machinery to launch an artist, and the people who are interested in being part of that like to know that they have company, and that what they're doing is it has a potential financial payoff, that it will be worth more because they're buying young artist X from Gallery Y. They believe, mistakenly or not, that it is likely to be worth more tomorrow than it is today, and maybe even more next year. So, but that thinking is, was not. All I can say is that thinking was not in place. Even actually, because I was involved with and aware of secondary market sales from my early days at Feigen. David Lloyd Krieger, who was the founder of the Geico insurance company, lived in Washington. He and his charming wife would come to New York 3 or 4 times a year. They'd visit Dick Feigen, and they would buy a Monet. They'd buy 3 or 4 Monets a year. And he built a great collection, which there's a Krieger Museum in Washington now. You can go and see them all. I don't think it ever crossed his mind that he was spending money he could well afford to buy something he liked. And he had no intention of selling, and he never did sell. And I think, there are probably plenty of people around today who think that's crazy, right?
Yeah.
Well, why would you waste money?
Well, I think what you're touching on, I mean, contemporary art, it's become so expensive. Most collectors, they need to think about the investment qualities of it. And not to say they're solely motivated by investment. Look, I think every collector approaches it a bit differently, but I think at a certain price point, it becomes a factor. And now, all of a sudden, there's a lot more riding on there being a market and support structure for the artist to succeed. So yeah, I think that it's definitely part of the equation.
They think of the value of the money they're spending relative to what else they could be doing with it. And that's, I think that is erroneous thinking, because if you have expendable income and you want to use it for enjoyment, and you go to an expensive restaurant, you have paid for the meal, you have the meal. If you take that money and you don't go to expensive restaurants for a while and you buy a painting, you've spent that money, right? You have something you can take home and enjoy. If in the fullness of time you sell it and you get what you paid, you've had it free for X number of years. You've had a free ride. If you sell it for less, that's the rent you've paid for the painting. That's what you paid to enjoy it. If you sell it for more, well, whoopee, that's great. But none of that is guaranteed. That is not guaranteed. That is going to sell for more. It isn't guaranteed that it's going to keep pace with inflation, even if you do sell it for a larger number than you paid for it. And people don't realize that they have the money to spend. They shouldn't spend more than they can afford. That's don't take the kids' college fund and buy a painting with it, because it's not liquid, and times change. The market shifts. Some things are more saleable than others. Not everything goes up. But ironically, the people who have built the best collections have stretched their wallets to pay more to get the best, even if people at the time said to them, as they would say to Norton Simon when he was building his collection, you paid too much for that. They bought something at auction and someone would come up and he'd say, do you have another one? I will buy it for the same price. And of course they didn't.
Right.
But again, in the fullness of time, if you've paid more for the best, when you come to sell it, or your children or grandchildren do, it is still the best, and it will go for more, depending upon what the value is at that future time.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of collecting advice, and it's one I've always felt as well. So if you can, always try to get the best quality example by an artist. I think more often than not, you have to overpay in the moment, as a high-quality example is one that someone usually doesn't want to sell. So you're going to have to overpay to motivate them to sell. But they usually end up being, I think, the best investment in the long term, as well as staples in one's collection.
If you overpay now, someone else is likely to overpay, quote unquote, when you sell it.
So you've worked with impressionist, modern, and contemporary art. How are you seeing different generations engaging with those different collecting categories now? For example, we're seeing younger collectors mostly focus on contemporary art. So what happens to these older categories if the new generation of collectors aren't as interested or at least focused on collecting them? And is this a new phenomenon, or is this an evolution that we've always seen?
Well, it's relatively new. Part of the reason is perhaps that, well, I was going to say, impressionist paintings are difficult to find in the market, but collecting tastes change. That's one thing. Great impressionist paintings that used to be $10 or $15 million can now be 50, 60, 70, or $80 million. So at the top of that market, the air is very, very thin indeed. And you do have people who are buying, but you do not have, it also dissuades people from trying to build collections of, used to be able to build a collection of impressionist paintings by buying a painting every year for $2 or $3 million. Now you just can't do that. And there are not a lot of dealers who are, selling those works. I think that the sea change happened perhaps in the 1990s, and part of it was that dealers engaging with contemporary artists or launching artists became aware that the auction houses could be vehicles for establishing values and also, in fact, establishing reputations. And this is, when I started at Christie's in 1984, I was the director of the Impressionist and Modern department, but my dear friend was Martha Baer, who ran the contemporary department. The contemporary department at Christie's in the early 80s concentrated entirely on secondary market works by then already very well-established artists like de Kooning or Rothko or Sam Francis. They certainly were not selling works by artists who were beginning to have exhibitions or who had only had 2 or 3 solo exhibitions. And naively, because I had been a dealer for 20 years before I joined Christie's, and I had been mostly involved in the contemporary market, I said to Martha, why don't you handle more work by younger artists? And she looked at me with horror and she said, no, the dealers would kill us because we would be selling them for much less than they're trying to get, meaning in fact that an artist whose paintings were selling for $1,500 in their gallery would sell for $500 or $600 if they came up for auction. And she was right. She was absolutely right. She said, we want to maintain a good relationship with the trade, but if we start selling young artists or emerging artists, it will crash their business. Now, from 1984, even perhaps to the mid-90s, what happened was the opposite. In other words, for better or for worse, the auctions became the way to establish an artist's visibility and prices. Because I hate to say this, it may not be true and it may be unkind, collectors at some point, I think, got lazy. They're too busy to go to galleries. They're too busy to talk to people like me and others without maybe having a purchase in mind, just to find out what's going on. So they look to the auctions because it looks as if auction data is solid or irrefutable. and they like data. A lot of these collectors are data driven, maybe because they're investors. I don't know. So that they look for data from the auction houses, and if an artist if an artist who is beginning to make a name for themselves sells for a high price at auction, it's an imprimatur to them. Now, you worked at an auction house. I worked at an auction house. We know, in fact, that every time the hammer comes down, it's the sale of a different object to different people. Well, maybe it's the same people, but it's a different object, different circumstances. It could go for a high price because everybody turned out. It can go for a low price because there was a flash flood in the subways. I don't know. There's a random aspect to auction results that I am leery of suggesting to people they take as biblical.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think with a lot of rising, more speculative contemporary artists, we saw over the past few years some really extraordinary prices achieved at auction that just didn't feel sustainable to the most veteran collectors. The gap between what they're willing to pay and what the works were actually selling for at auction, I can't remember a gap so wide in recent art market history, really. So you've been in the art market for a long time. I think our listeners would really appreciate any additional wisdom you can share with us regarding collecting and the things that we should be thinking about as we're building our collections, whether it's a new collector or even an established one.
Look at as much as possible. Go to museums. Spend Saturdays or whenever going in and out of galleries. You're not everybody's going to jump on you and try and sell you something. It's just a question of training your eye. I think that the key is making up your own mind. You can be directed towards a type of art, a price range of art, by a good advisor. You can't be told what you like. And I've sometimes had arguments with collectors who, faced with two works that I believe to be absolutely equal in every respect, believed that I could tell them which one was the one. And I can't, because I can tell them which one I like, but I can't tell them which one they like. And there are an amazing number of people spending very large sums of money who don't really know whether they like what they're buying or not. They believe that they may be sound purchases. They believe that it may put them in a sort of a social circle that they want to be in. But being able to enjoy something means, first of all, you have to look at it in the flesh for more than a few seconds. And our technology today has reversed the usual process of purchasing works of art, I think. In other words, people, they first see a photograph on somebody's phone, a pixelated, backlit, sharp, clear, colorful image, right? And then they or their advisor enter an extended dialogue with the dealer or the owner about, is it really this color? Do you have a condition report? All of this. And then finally, they go and look at it. Perhaps. I mean, I hope they go and look at it, right? But if they were in the habit of going to museums, going to auction houses, going to dealers, getting to know people, they will be able to see the painting first. If they don't like it, they don't like it. That's it. If they like it, then they can start to ask those important questions. So engaging with the object, to me, is the start. Having the object speak to you meaningfully, it is the second thing. And if those things don't happen, you're not really collecting. You're accumulating, and you may be investing. But I don't also really believe in the idea of a perfect type of collection. A perfect type of collection may be one. I have a lot of different interests. I may not know much about medieval art, but I can if I see something that's interesting. I bought something that was 3,000 years old from a dealer in London, a brooch. I paid $1,200 for it because I thought it was fantastic. Now I don't know, it could be fake. I don't care, but I can buy works by conceptual artists who are just kind of getting off the getting off the starting block. So Catholicity in taste does not mean you don't know what you're doing. Albert Barnes bought tons of everything, and we're keeping his collection absolutely intact. And yet you could say there was no real direction to that.
I think those are really great pieces of advice that we should continue to think about as we grow our collections. Michael, thank you so much again for coming onto the podcast and discussing a variety of topics that you explore in your new memoir, Portrait of the Art Dealer as a Young Man, New York in the 60s, which comes out in early September. You can get it then at your local bookstore, at your museum store, or online, and you can also pre-order it now on Amazon. Michael, we really appreciate your perspective on everything. Thanks so much again for joining us.
Adam, thank you very much indeed. It was a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.